Hi everyone, welcome to this latest interview in the alumni series. I'm joined by Gillian More, who's very kindly agreed to speak with me about her time at the AIRE Centre and subsequently. Gillian, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can I start by asking what initially attracted you to the law?
I guess because I wanted to help people, really, which is still really kind of my motivation, you know. I've never really been interested in going and doing competition law and looking at agreements. I'm more interested in welfare law, immigration law. Those were always the kind of things that motivated me.
Mm-hmm. And how did do you remember how you first came across the AIRE Centre?
Yes. I used to teach law, and I decided, I was a university lecturer in law, and I decided I wanted to do something. At that time, you could teach law even though you weren't legally qualified, so I wasn't qualified. So I came to London to do my bar exams, and you have to do this year at bar school. And whilst I was doing that, I was teaching part-time in London. I was teaching at both King's College and I was teaching at LSE. And at LSE, I was working with Damien Chalmers, who's now a professor of EU law. He was a lecturer at LSE at the time, and he's now in University of Singapore, I think. And Damien was, I think, like you, Paul, he was also a trustee at the AIRE Centre. So he told me about the AIRE Centre. And one of the reasons he told me about the AIRE Centre, because the AIRE Centre at the time was in Brixton, and that's where I lived. So in fact, it was just down the road. It was just down the road from me in Brixton.
That's hilarious. Oh, that's amazing. I've seen pictures of the Brixton office, but yes.
Yeah, the Euro Business Centre or something it was called, this great big glass thing, which was great in the winter because it was very light. But in the summer, it actually got very hot because all the sun came through these glass windows. So yeah. So that was it. So Damien kind of knew, and he also knew the person who ran the AIRE Centre, Nuala. And Damien quite rightly thought that I would get on well with Nuala. And Damien knew roughly the sort of things I was interested in. And he said, yeah, you know, you might enjoy volunteering at the AIRE Centre, Gillian. So because I was studying slightly dry procedural stuff for my bar exams, he said, why don't you go down? And obviously, as soon as I got there, I loved it. Because what I taught before was EU law, so I knew EU law. And what the AIRE Centre did was EU law in practice. And in fact, I learned so much at the AIRE Centre because I'd sort of come from an employment law background. I did more like a EU employment law, working time, transfer of undertakings, those sorts of things. And when I got to the AIRE Centre, that was where I learned about EU law and free movement of persons. EU laws apply to immigration. That was really where I got my grounding in that area.
I mean, this is the sort of mid-90s, I think, we're taking you back to. And I wonder if there's any sort of particular case you worked on that sort of stands out in your mind as a small memory.
Well, I wouldn't say there's a particular case, but what I remember at the time, so obviously this was before the accession of the Eastern European countries to the EU, but they still had these, what were they called? I think were they called association agreements? I'm not sure they were called association. They had these agreements, Europe agreements, that's what they were called. They had Europe agreements with the EU or the European community as it was then. Which covered certain parts of the single market, but not everything. So there was no free movement of workers, but it gave them the freedom of establishment. And that's one of my lasting memories, that we did an awful lot of work on that. And we had this complete specialism in advising Eastern European workers on how to set up a business in the UK, what they needed to, well, not to how to set it up, what they needed to show that they had a running business, and how to show that they had a right to actually be in the UK and work as self-employed there. And we worked on various aspects of that. There was both some legal challenge that we provided some advice on, there were a lot of people who phoned our telephone line. We used to have a telephone line at that time. It was every afternoon. And we also had other centres, legal advice centres across the UK used to phone and ask us for advice on these issues. Because the AIRE Centre always did both ECHR, European Convention work, and EU work. And I tended more to be on the EU side, because what we did, we worked, which was the original Citizen Signpost Service. It was called the Citizen Signpost Service, where the EU representation in the UK, we dealt with the office in London. They received a lot of queries, requests for help, and the EU representation used to just pass them on to us at the AIRE Centre. And I dealt with a lot of those. And they covered everything, you know, from students' right to get a grant. The recognition of professional qualifications, social security issues. It was a very, very wide range. But then at the same time, there was another very dedicated team who were doing the ECHR work. And at the time, that was when the AIRE Centre had the big victory in the case of D versus the UK, which was to do with when the Home Office wanted to deport somebody who was suffering from AIDS back to his country, which I think it was to St. Kitts, where at the time there was no treatment for people with AIDS. And the European Court of Human Rights found that that was inhuman and degrading treatment. So it was a bit of a landmark judgment. And I remember, whilst I was doing all my EU stuff to do with Europe agreements, students, etc., the other part of the team was working very closely on this case. And also, with it being the mid-1990s, there was starting to be a demand for training because the Human Rights Act came into force in 1998. So yeah, it was a very happening period. I mean, the AIRE Centre, I'm sure, is very happening, but that's kind of what was happening at the time.
Yeah,
Alan and Nuala were preparing D, and we were beavering away on all these diverse EU issues.
It's just fascinating. I mean, you've mentioned already that that you learned a lot about, or this is a time when you were learning a lot about free movement rights, particularly in EU law. Are there other aspects of your experience at the AIRE Centre that you've sort of drawn on in your career subsequently?
Well, I suppose I learned quite a lot about how the Legal Advice Centre in the UK worked, because, as I said, the AIRE Centre was a resource for other legal advice centres. I learned the value of just being able to make contacts and pick up the phone and ask people, do you know about this? The need for legal networks to be abreast with what was happening, to know what cases were going on. There's a lot of kind of skills that they don't really teach you about at law school, as to actually working as a practicing lawyer. Because I spent quite a period of time at the AIRE Centre, because I was there not only just as a volunteer, but actually when I finished pupillage, I came back to the AIRE Centre and I worked as an employed legal officer for about 9 months. I worked, full time, and we organised. I seem to remember we organised a couple of conferences. Well, there was certainly one big conference we organised, but the exact nature of what it was. Oh yeah, there was another one where I don't know how Nuala got this contract, but we were training immigration judges. I remember this big event in this big hall in the centre of London, and it was to do with the Amsterdam Treaty. There were new powers that had been put into the EU treaty to do with the EU common immigration policy. Mm-hmm. And that was another event. And yeah, I remember having to sit up on this panel, all these judges, asking us difficult questions. Yeah. But because I'd previously done teaching, I'd already been exposed to doing a bit of teaching, but it was a different environment doing it in the AIRE Centre, because I was dealing with practitioners.
Yeah. And if we fast forward to today, you're working now at the European Commission. Can you give us an idea of what your current role involves? What's a sort of typical day looks like, if there is one?
Well, in fact, what I do at the European Commission now is I work in this service that's called Solve It, which is practical problem solving in EU law. So to a certain extent, I've gone back to my AIRE Centre roots. I have had a number of jobs in the European Commission. I started doing social security coordination. I did free movement of workers. I was there at the time dealing with a lot of issues to do with the end of the transitional arrangements for Bulgarian Romanian workers. I worked in the UK referendum task force. So I worked on the deal with David Cameron, the part of the agreement that never came into force, which had aspects to do with free movement of workers and social security. I worked in free movement of persons, so the Free Movement Directive 2004-38, and now I'm in Solve It, and we kind of deal with all issues linked to the single market. So it's a network. So in every country, EU and EEA country, there is a Solve It Centre. Unfortunately, the one in the UK closed down when the UK left the EU, so we no longer deal with the UK. And it's a practical approach. There's an online system. If businesses, so it's both businesses and citizens, if they experience a problem in the single market, largely with a public authority that takes a decision that they find problematic, they can lodge this online complaint. And we have this system in place where the administrations will work together to try and negotiate a solution to that. And it works with an online database, and it's coordinated. We assist and coordinate in the European Commission. So we provide training events. Next week, we're sort of doing a training for newcomers, people who are new in the centres in the member state. And it is, to me, it's not really the AIRE Centre, but it's not dissimilar to some of the work I did in the past, because it's to do with practical problems that causes barriers, problems of public authority. So in a normal day, for example, this morning there was a query from somebody who'd worked in Romania and actually in the UK. And he had insurance periods in the UK, and it's now a difficulty for him is how can he get the document from the UK to show that he actually worked and has insurance periods in the UK. So the Romanian authorities can't ask him to pay social security again for that same period of work. There was another case to do with a woman who worked in Sweden, who she did 1 day of work in Germany and then started her maternity leave. She received all of her maternity pay from the Swedish authorities, but then she received a decision that the Swedish authority said, sorry, we shouldn't have paid you that maternity pay. It should have been paid by Germany. You have to pay it back. So you can see it's all kind of practical problems, and I give legal input to these sorts of issues. Really interesting. Yeah, and I can see how it doesn't feel a million miles away from the sort of stuff that the AIRE Centre continues to do, actually, on the advice line, second tier especially. And I think my last question is whether you had any sort of top tips for the AIRE Centre's current interns who are at the start of their career. Just the top tips? Well, always to take a can-do approach. Never think that the law's against you and you're not going to be able to find a solution, or that you haven't got the evidence to bring the case. You can always you just got to ask the client, have you got this, have you got that, as much information as possible. And sometimes you need to take a bit of an out-of-the-box approach to think what information is missing from this case in order to kind of solve the problem. And talking as much to clients, talking as much as you can to the person on the other side. And as I said, as I indicated earlier, the importance of kind of building a network. Having a network of contacts is always hugely helpful. And that was one of the things that I certainly learned from Nuala being in the AIRE Centre, was that if there's a question you can't answer, you need to know who to call, who can help you with that answer. Or because obviously we didn't use email so much in those days. Now maybe you can email them and ask them, but it was always that. And we had a board on the wall with all the helpful numbers. And there was a whiteboard. Those were the days of the whiteboard. I'm not sure if the AIRE Centre office still has one, but we had a whiteboard with all these scribbled numbers, and this was who to call. And in those days, we even had a number for Rob Cornelissen in the European Commission. Nuala had a number of somebody in the Commission to call.
Hotline. Yes.
And that was, in fact, the first person I worked for when I came to the Commission, by pure and utter coincidence, because coming to the Commission, I sort of did a completely different route. I didn't do it with the AIRE Centre, but by pure coincidence, the first person who gave me the job was the name who used to be on the whiteboard in the AIRE Centre.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Gillian, thank you so much for your time to speak with us, and it's really great to meet you.
Yeah, likewise, it's a pleasure. So good luck with the work, and exactly, remember that there's nothing as a trainee that you can't do.